The clock above the espresso machine didn't just tick, it groaned, a rhythmic metallic protest against the silence of a Brooklyn Christmas Eve. Zola gripped the cold steel handle of the last heavy industrial chair, hoisting it onto a marble tabletop with a grunt that echoed through the cavernous, empty space of Carter's coffee. Her skin, the color of rich, unrefined cacao, shimmered under the dying glow of the overhead Edison bulbs, slick with a fine sheen of sweat and the residue of a 12-hour shift. Outside, the world was a blurred watercolor of charcoal slush and flickering neon, the holiday cheer reduced to the lonely hum of a red and green sign vibrating against the brick. The air in the cafe carried the heavy, cloying scent of stale cinnamon, burnt milk, and the ozone that always preceded a heavy snow. Every joint in her 25-year-old frame radiated a dull, throbbing heat, a biological ledger of the 3 years she had spent tethered to this floor. Since the accident had claimed her parents, the shop was no longer a business. It was a fortress, a wooden and glass box where she fought daily to keep the ghosts of debt and grief at bay. Her fingers, stained permanently with the dark oils of roasted beans, traced the jagged grain of the counter. She was hollowed out, a vessel of pure exhaustion. She reached for the heavy brass ring of keys, their weight familiar and cold, a sensory anchor to her reality. The haptic feedback of the metal clicking against the marble felt like a finality, a period at the end of a long, grueling sentence. She whispered a quiet prayer to the empty room, her voice a gravelly rasp that barely cleared her lips, telling herself that tomorrow would be different, though she knew the lie by heart. The deadbolt was halfway through its rotation when the sound shattered the silence, 3 sharp, measured raps against the glass. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a traveler seeking warmth or the sloppy thud of a holiday drunk. It was a calculated, authoritative sound that vibrated through the glass and into the marrow of her bones. Zola froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, the adrenaline sudden and sharp, metallic on the back of her tongue. She peered through the condensation, her breath hitching as she saw the silhouette carved out of the Brooklyn mist. A man stood there, framed by the guttering street lamps, his presence so massive it seemed to warp the very light around the doorway. He didn't move, didn't plead. He simply waited. Reluctantly, driven by a pull she couldn't rationalize, Zola turned the key back and cracked the door, the bell above chiming a lonely, warning note. The cold air rushed in, smelling of expensive tobacco, winter rain, and something sharper, the iron scent of a man who lived on the edge of violence. He was Korean, with features that looked as though they had been sculpted from obsidian, sharp and uncompromising. His coat was a masterpiece of black wool, tailored so perfectly it looked like armor, thrown over a silk shirt that was unbuttoned at the throat to reveal a heavy gold chain. His hair was a chaotic slick of raven-dark strands, damp from the sleet, falling over eyes that were a deep, fathomless onyx, eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the flickering neon light of the street. Those eyes didn't just look at her, they catalogued her, reading the weariness in her shoulders and the defiance in her jaw. He didn't speak immediately, letting the silence stretch until it was thick enough to suffocate. Then, his voice broke the air, a low, resonant baritone that carried the weight of a command disguised as a plea. "One last coffee?" he asked. The world seemed to stop spinning. Her survival instinct screamed. Zola should have slammed the door, should have retreated into the shadows of the back office and called the precinct, but her hand remained glued to the brass handle. There was a vibration in the air, a frequency of shared trauma that she recognized, a weariness in his eyes that mirrored the hollow ache in her own chest. He looked like a man who had walked through 1,000 fires and was finally looking for a place to let the embers die. "We're closed," she managed to say, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain stoic. He tilted his head slightly, a small, dark smile ghosting his lips, one that didn't reach the predatory sharpness of his gaze. "Please," he said, the word weighted with an intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Just 1 cup. I've traveled a long way for something real." It was madness, letting a stranger in at midnight, especially one who radiated the kind of high-stakes authority that usually ended in a police report. Yet, she found herself stepping back, the floorboards creaking under her weight as she signaled him inside. He entered with a grace that was entirely too quiet for a man of his stature. The cafe felt smaller. The air turned electric. As he settled into a chair by the frosted window, his presence colonized the room, making the mismatched furniture and the chalk-scrawled menus look like artifacts of a distant, simpler civilization. Zola retreated behind the safety of the counter, her hands moving with the practiced, technical precision of a master artisan. She reached for her private stash of beans, a sun-dried Yirgachev she had sourced herself, the scent of bergamot and jasmine erupting as she dumped them into the hopper. She adjusted the grind size to a fine, sandy grit, the screech of the burrs a familiar, grounding discord. Her internal focus narrowed to the task. She felt the heat of the boiler radiating through the stainless steel, the vibration of the pump thrumming through her fingertips. She weighed out exactly 18 grams of coffee, the scale's red digits flickering in the dim light. This wasn't just a drink. It was a ritual of hospitality offered to a man who looked like he had forgotten the meaning of the word. She felt the tightening in her chest begin to ease, replaced by the technical demands of the extraction. The pressure gauge climbed to 9 bars. The liquid gold flowed. She poured the espresso into a small, chipped ceramic mug, the one she usually reserved for her own midnight contemplations, and set it before him. The steam rose in a delicate plume, curling around his sharp features as he leaned in to inhale the aroma. "Surprise me," he had said, and as he took the first sip, she watched his jaw relax, the tension in his broad shoulders finally yielding to the warmth. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting second, the dangerous aura evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked profoundly alone. "It's good," he murmured, his voice a soft friction against the quiet. Better than the overpriced sludge they serve in the penthouses. Zola leaned against the back counter, her arms crossed, watching the way his thumb traced the crack in the ceramic. "You don't look like a man who settles for sludge," she countered, her voice gaining a newfound steadiness. He opened his eyes, the dark, unyielding depth of his gaze locking onto hers with a sudden, searing intensity. "I settle for what is necessary," he said. "But tonight, I wanted something real. Not perfect, just real." The silence that followed was charged with the high-voltage hum of things unsaid, a narrative tension that vibrated in the spaces between their breaths. Zola felt a strange, magnetic pull toward this man, a curiosity that overrode the common sense that had kept her alive in Brooklyn this long. She saw the raw, purple bruising on his knuckles as he gripped the mug, a stark contrast to the gold watch that shimmered on his wrist. "You're Logan Kong," she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow, a sensory memory of a headline she'd seen on a discarded newspaper just that morning. The name was synonymous with the iron-fisted control of the city's underground, a shadow king who moved through the upper echelons of power with the silence of a ghost. Her blood ran cold, a hollow, frozen ache spreading through her limbs. She had led a predator into her sanctuary, a man whose very name was an incantation for violence. He didn't deny it. He simply took another sip of the coffee, his expression unreadable. "And you're Zola," he replied. "The woman who keeps the lights on when the rest of the world goes dark." The next morning, the city was draped in a deceptive white shroud of snow, but the peace felt fragile, a thin veil over the mounting dread in Zola's gut. Every time the bell above the door chimed, she flinched, her internal physiology reacting to the ghost of Logan's presence. She went through the motions, frothing milk to a microfoam consistency, tamping down pucks with a mechanical force, but her mind was stuck in the loop of the previous night. Her younger sister, Nia, was busy wiping down the front tables, her movements energetic and oblivious. "You're vibrating, Z," Nia said, her voice a sharp, youthful contrast to the heavy thoughts in Zola's head. "You've been staring at that portafilter for 3 minutes. Something happened last night." Zola tried to dismiss it with a wave of her hand, but her fingers were trembling, the haptic memory of Logan's presence still clinging to her skin. "Just a late customer," she lied, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. "A stranger in the dark." By the afternoon, the lie had rotted. The news on the wall-mounted television, usually muted and ignored, began to flash images of black SUVs and police tape in Midtown. The anchors spoke in hushed, urgent tones about a power vacuum in the calm organization, about a brewing war between the established order and a splinter cell led by a man named Marcus Duca. Zola watched the screen, her chest tightening until it felt like her ribs might snap under the pressure. She saw a brief clip of Logan, his face a mask of lethal calm as he moved through a crowd of reporters, the same gold chain she had seen the night before glinting under the camera flashes. He wasn't just a customer. He was a target, a man whose presence in her cafe had marked the walls with an invisible, blood-red X. She looked at Nia, laughing as she served a group of carolers, and the ache in Zola's heart turned into a sharp, jagged terror. She had invited the storm inside. The sanctuary was breached. That night, the snow fell harder, a thick, suffocating blanket that dampened the sounds of the street, making the world feel small and claustrophobic. Zola was alone in the shop when the bell chimed, but this time, there was no knock. Logan stepped inside, his long black coat dusted with white, his face shadowed by the collar. He didn't sit. He stood by the door, his body a coiled spring of restrained power. "You shouldn't have come back," Zola whispered, her voice cracking as she gripped the edge of the counter. The smell of ozone and wet wool filled the space, a sensory trigger that brought back the electric fear of their first encounter. Logan moved toward her, his steps heavy and deliberate on the hardwood floor. "I came to tell you to lock the doors," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. "The world is about to get very loud, Zola. And I won't have your name mentioned in the noise." He reached across the counter, his bruised hand hovering near hers, a gesture of protection that felt more like a threat to her peace. Before she could respond, the street outside erupted. The screech of tires on ice sliced through the silence, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of car doors slamming. Logan's demeanor shifted instantly. The weary man disappeared, replaced by the predator. He reached into his jacket, and though Zola didn't see the weapon, she felt the sudden, lethal weight of its presence. "Get behind the counter," he commanded, his voice a razor's edge. Now, two men in leather jackets burst through the door, their eyes darting through the dim light, settling on Logan's dark, unwavering stare with a hungry, violent intensity. The air in the cafe, once filled with the warmth of coffee and Christmas, turned cold and metallic. Zola collapsed to the floor, her heart thrumming in her fingertips, the vibration of the floorboards telegraphing the movement of the men. She heard the sharp, terrifying crack of a gunshot, the sound of glass shattering into 1,000 crystalline diamonds. The midnight blend was over. The war had arrived at Carter's Coffee. The chaos lasted only seconds, but in Zola's mind, it stretched into an eternity of sensory overload. She heard Logan's grunted exertion, the sound of a body hitting a table with a sickening crunch, and the final, heavy thud of the front door being kicked shut. When she finally looked up, the cafe was a wreckage of broken porcelain and splintered wood. Logan stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, a trickle of dark blood running down his temple. He looked at her, and for the first time, the obsidian depth of his eyes had melted into something raw and terrifyingly vulnerable. "I told you to lock the door," he said softly, the words a jagged confession. He didn't wait for her to scream or thank him. He simply turned and walked back into the snow, leaving her in the ruins of her life. Zola sat on the floor, the smell of gunpowder and espresso swirling around her, realizing that the man who had come for one last coffee had just signed her death warrant, or perhaps her salvation. The following days were a blur of police statements and insurance forms, the mundane bureaucracy of a life interrupted by high-stakes violence. Zola moved through the shop like a ghost, her hands performing tasks without the guidance of her mind. She cleaned the blood from the floorboards, the iron scent lingering even after the bleach had dried. Nia was terrified, her youthful spark extinguished by the reality of the bullet holes in the walls. "We have to leave, Z," Nia pleaded, her voice a thin, wavering thread. "This isn't our fight," but Zola couldn't leave. Every time she touched the handle of the espresso machine, she felt the haptic ghost of Logan's hand. She was anchored to the wreckage, waiting for the other shoe to drop, her internal focus constantly scanning the shadows outside for a flash of dark eyes. The neighborhood had gone silent. the regulars replaced by men in dark suits who sat in idling cars across the street. She was being watched. She was part of the narrative DNA of the Kong family now. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of gray, unremarkable afternoon that usually invited boredom. Nia had gone to the market to get fresh milk, leaving Zola alone to prep the evening batches. When the phone rang, the sound was a jagged intrusion into the quiet. Zola. A voice hissed, unfamiliar and dripping with a cruel, rhythmic cadence. Your sister is a very slow walker. We've decided to give her a ride. The world tilted. The floor seemed to liquefy under Zola's feet, her chest collapsing in on itself as the air left her lungs. Who is this? She gasped, her fingertips digging into the marble until the stone bit into her skin. Marcus Duca, the voice replied, followed by a low, mocking laugh. Tell Logan that his weakness is currently sitting in the back of a very cold van. If he wants her back, he knows the price. The line went dead. The silence that followed was a physical weight, a suffocating shroud of peak terror that threatened to crush the life out of her. She didn't call the police. She knew that in this world, uniforms were just targets for more violence. She called the only number she had found on a small, embossed card Logan had left on the counter the night of the shooting. He answered on the first ring, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. Zola, he asked, and she could hear the immediate shift in his tone, the way the authorities snapped into place. They have Nia, she whispered, the words breaking apart as they left her throat.
Duca.
He said, you know the price. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end, the kind of silence that preceded a landslide. I am coming for you, Logan said, the promise weighted with a finality that made her heart skip a beat. Stay in the shop. Do not move. I will burn this city to the ground before she is harmed. He hung up, leaving Zola in the center of her sanctuary, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the steam wand to stay upright. Logan arrived in a motorcade of black steel, his presence more formidable than ever. He burst into the cafe, his face a mask of granite, his eyes burning with a cold, dark fire that made the very air seem to crackle. He didn't ask questions. He simply reached out and took Zola's hand, his grip firm and steadying. We go together, he said. Duca wants a show. We will give him a finale. They drove to the docks, the smell of salt and diesel fumes filling the car, the haptic vibration of the engine a constant, low-frequency hum. Zola felt a strange, detached calm settling over her, the adrenaline-fueled focus of a person who has already accepted their fate. She watched the Brooklyn Bridge pass overhead, its steel skeleton a metaphor for the golden chains that Logan had spoken of. He was a king, and she was his unintended queen, both of them tethered to a legacy of blood and duty. The warehouse was a cavernous tomb of rusted iron and shadows, the air thick with the scent of old grease and stagnant water. Marcus Duca stood in the center of the floor, his face twisted into a smirk that didn't hide the frantic energy in his eyes. He held a knife to Nia's throat, the blade a thin, silver line against her dark skin. Zola felt the breath leave her body, a visceral, hollow ache of memory flashing back to her parents' funeral, the same sense of impending, irreversible loss. Logan stepped forward, his movements measured and deliberate, his hands held open to show he was unarmed. Let her go, Marcus, Logan said, his voice a calm, lethal baritone. The war is between us. She is a civilian, Duca laughed, a high, reedy sound that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. There are no civilians in your world, Logan. Just victims and survivors. The violence that followed was a blur of technical veracity and raw, primal power. Logan didn't just fight. He dismantled. He moved through Duca's men with the precision of a surgeon, his blows calculated to maximize damage. Zola watched, her chest tightening with every crack of bone and every muffled grunt of pain. She saw the flash of the knife, the spray of blood against the concrete, and the sudden, jarring silence as the last of Duca's men fell. Logan stood over Duca, his hand around the man's throat, his ink-dark eyes devoid of any human emotion. You touched what was mine, Logan whispered, the words a death sentence. He didn't kill him. He broke him, leaving him a shattered heap on the cold floor. He turned to Nia, his hands unexpectedly gentle as he cut her ties. "Go to your sister," he commanded. The reunion was a chaotic mess of tears and shaking limbs, but Zola's gaze was fixed on Logan. He looked at her, and in that moment, the shared secret between them became a bond that could never be broken. The fire came 3 nights later. It wasn't a tactical strike or a calculated move. It was a desperate, scorched earth act by the remnants of Duca's crew. Zola woke to the smell of smoke, a heavy, acrid scent that bit into her lungs and made her eyes sting. She rushed to the cafe, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, only to find the sanctuary engulfed in orange and red. The heat was a physical blow, a wall of energy that pushed her back toward the sidewalk. "No!" she screamed, the sound lost in the roar of the flames. Everything was going, the chairs she had stacked, the marble counters she had polished, the dream she had inherited. She felt a hand on her shoulder, a firm, grounding presence in the middle of the devastation. Logan was there, his face illuminated by the fire, his expression one of profound, cathartic sorrow. "It's over, Zola," he said softly. "The old world is gone." She turned to him, her face streaked with soot and tears, the cold, hollow ache of loss finally breaking her. "I have nothing left," she sobbed, clutching at his coat. He pulled her into his arms, his body a fortress against the heat of the fire. "You have me," he said, the words of vow that carried the weight of his entire empire. "And I will build you a new sanctuary, one where the doors stay locked and the shadows stay outside." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, the smell of smoke and coffee swirling around them. "I was a man of golden chains," he whispered, "but you showed me what it means to be free. I am not a boss tonight. I am just a man who wants to take you home." The fire roared behind them, a restorative hope beginning to flicker in the wreckage. Months later, the new Carter's Coffee opened its doors, a sleek, modern space of glass and steel that sat in the heart of a revitalized Brooklyn. It was a cathedral of caffeine, a place where the technical details of the brew were celebrated as high art. Zola stood behind the counter, her hands steady as she calibrated the new grinders, the haptic feedback of the machines a comforting, familiar rhythm. Nia was there too, her laughter back, her art gracing the walls in vibrant, bold strokes. The neighborhood had changed. The shadows had retreated, replaced by a sense of shared community and protection. Logan was a constant presence, no longer a ghost in the mist, but a partner in the light. He sat at the same window table every night, his dark eyes watching Zola with a pride that made her skin tingle. One Christmas Eve, as the snow began to fall in soft, silent flakes, Zola prepared to close the shop. She stacked the chairs, the metal clicking against the polished floor with a satisfying thud. She reached for the keys, the weight of the brass a reminder of how far she had come. The bell chimed, and she didn't flinch. Logan stood in the doorway, his coat dusted with white, a small, elegant box in his hand. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the counter and set the box down next to the espresso machine. "One last coffee?" he asked, his voice a low, melodic friction. Zola smiled, her heart full, her chest no longer tight with fear. She reached for the box, but he caught her hand, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight, we start the next chapter." He opened the box to reveal a ring carved from dark, polished stone, set with a single, brilliant black diamond. "I don't want a throne, Zola. I just want a life with you." She looked at the ring, then at the man who had walked through fire to save her. "Yes," she whispered. The sanctuary was finally complete. The story had found its status quo. They were no longer perfect, just real.